New Zealand just joined Australia, the UK, Norway, and other countries that are starting to look into the Jehovah's Witness religion very closely. And like every government that looks into this cult, what they've found is very disturbing. So disturbing, in fact, that the Jehovah's Witnesses try to avoid the findings from being published by any means possible. So let's look into the findings of the New Zealand's Royal Commission on how this cult hides abusers while leaving children unprotected. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We're about to cross the 10,000 mark. Thank you so much, guys. Let's begin. The report, which you can find linked below and which I encourage you to read, opens with a summary of its contents and a statement of its purpose in Chapter 1. And the purpose is quite clear: to look into the Jehovah's Witnesses and how they handle minors, what happens with allegations of abuse inside this religion, what might increase abuse to happen, how this religion is preventing and responding to these cases, and any obstacles that individual Jehovah's Witnesses may have to disclose their own abuse. Chapter 2 is all about the context of the Jehovah's Witnesses. It goes from its origins with a disillusioned Charles Taze Russell through the creation of what came to be the legal entity of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania, headquartered in Warwick, New York, known as Bethel. It also details how this religion is directed globally by the governing body and how the religion has had significant growth in New Zealand since 1945, with kingdom halls widespread across New Zealand cities. Then it goes into the role of the elders. In New Zealand, there are over 1,500 elders who oversee spiritual matters, organize fieldwork, lead services, and conduct judicial committees. They all have to follow guidelines from the handbook Shepherd the Flock of God and other Jehovah's Witness publications. Elders determine a wrongdoer standing in the faith and can reprove or disfellowship unrepentant members, with members being taught to cooperate with them and to believe the Holy Spirit appoints and helps elders. It also goes through the role of ministerial servants who basically assist the elders and talks about the patriarchal hierarchy of the religion, meaning elders, ministerial servants, and all others kinds of positions of authority can only be fulfilled by men, fundamentally excluding women from these roles. Finally, it describes the religion's relevant features, like how the Jehovah's Witnesses' way of life is to strictly adhere to religious doctrines set by the governing body. It accurately describes the Jehovah's Witnesses as believing in a strict Bible interpretation, along with their belief in the imminent end of the world, their male headship, and the importance of door-to-door preaching. It also mentions the isolationist nature of Jehovah's Witnesses, with them believing being part of this religion and seeing any other Jehovah's Witness as their brothers and sisters and part of their spiritual family is considered as part of what they need to do to earn salvation from imminent Armageddon. Then it talks about what Jehovah's Witnesses refer to as gross sin, which CSA is a part of, how they're investigated by a committee of elders who decide whether to disfellowship the person or not, and how this is supposed to be a loving arrangement. People can also leave the faith by disassociating, but anyone leaving the faith, whether disfellowshipped or disassociated, will be shunned by the whole religious group, social, network, and family included. It also points out how those in the faith who do not preach are considered blood guilty and are also somewhat shunned, even citing a study into the Jehovah's Witnesses and how the faith negatively impacts basic social needs. It ends by describing how Jehovah's Witnesses convert by citing the experience of Jasmine Grew, who credits her mom's conversion to her vulnerable state when she was approached by the cult, and how she didn't see her father, who didn't want to get involved in the cult, until she was 14 years old. This whole chapter is pretty much to set the ground for someone who has never been or known a Jehovah's Witness to have enough context about this cult, how it operates, how it shuns, and how the culture works. And now that we have a general picture of the Jehovah's Witnesses and how they work, chapter 3 dives deep into how this religion cares for children. It starts with what Jehovah's Witnesses usually say when questioned about how they take care of children, by saying that the Jehovah's Witnesses do not operate formal institutions like schools or foster care services, and that the care was usually in the form of pastoral care and informal support. This care includes spiritual, social, emotional, and material support, often involving visiting, counseling, and religious activities. It also goes into the definition of care, since the Jehovah's Witnesses try to get away with saying that they do not provide care for children on a technicality. The first way the Jehovah's Witnesses provide care for children is through the door-to-door ministry, a core activity in this religion, where witnesses are paired up with other witnesses to preach, minors included. During the door-to-door ministry, minors can get separated from their parents and assigned to another Jehovah's Witness, usually someone considered a mature member of the congregation, so young members can begin practicing their preaching skills. This doesn't happen all the time with minors, since minors frequently get paired up with their parents, but it definitely does happen often. Jehovah's Witnesses also provide care in the form of pastoral care, which sometimes involves being alone with children. Despite the faith stance that elders should not be alone with children, the investigation showed instances where elders conducted Bible studies and other activities without parental supervision. This pastoral care role assumed responsibility for children, giving the trust placed in elders by the faith. And the third and final way that children are under the care of this religion is when they are participating in what this investigation calls working bees, which is Kiwi for basically any organized activity where members of a community volunteer to do things like cleaning, maintenance, or other labor-intense activities. In the context of Jehovah's Witnesses in New Zealand, working bees would involve members, including children, participating in activities like building, cleaning, and maintaining the Kingdom Hall, the building where they worship, as well as other construction projects, usually for the religion, cleaning and upkeeping convention centers when they are used by them, and other projects of this kind. These working bees and other organized events involved unsupervised care of children by elders, which the inquiry found constituted a form of care responsibility assumed by the faith. The chapter establishes all of this mostly through testimonies of former members of the religion, and it's a very accurate picture of how and when children are left to the care not of their parents, but of other members of the congregation, usually elders, who may even instruct them on what to do. That perfectly transitions us to chapter 4, which is the most damaging for this religion, and the reason why this religion tried to keep this a secret. This involves horrible stories of CSA, so consider this your content warning. I will not be dwelling on the details as this is just a summary, and because there's stuff here that is so horrible, this platform actually has rules in place to remove any videos that even talk about it. That's why I invite you to read at least this chapter for yourself if you can handle it, since this whole investigation and its findings are mostly thanks to these brave people who spoke up. It starts by addressing the extreme power imbalance and influence experienced in this cult. Elders hold significant power, with the religion constantly promoting obedience and submission, increasing the risk of abuse, particularly for women and children. And that's not contained to the congregation either. Former members testified confirming how this religion influences almost all aspects of their lives, limiting social interactions and personal choices. Jehovah's Witnesses children face restrictions in school, like being prohibited from participating in holidays and certain classes, reflecting this religion's teachings to not be a part of the world. They also have limited education and career opportunities, with higher education being discouraged. And to ensure compliance, you always have the belief in Armageddon and the fear of being destroyed if you don't do what this religion says, including submitting to the elders. The elders' control over the congregation comes into play when someone commits a sin, with members being encouraged to report their own and other sins to elders, and even children were expected to inform on their peers. Compliance is also ensured by limiting how much access people in this cult have to information, with external information restricted and demonized whenever it goes against their views, and especially when it's directly critical of the group. That's where the report starts to talk about the abuse experienced by members of this cult. It starts by talking about this religion's strict stance against blood transfusions, even in life-threatening situations, which leads members to martyrize themselves and die before accepting a blood transfusion. It also talked about how LGBTQ plus members face significant challenges and discrimination in the cult, with the cult often attempting to cure their sexuality, and when inevitably failing, shunning the member for not being straight, friends and family included. Witnesses also described the emotional and psychological impact of the group's control, including feelings of guilt and fear, made way worse by the constant expectation of Armageddon, which this group believes is imminent. And it's this incredibly high level of influence and the power imbalance between leaders and members that increase the risk of abuse and silencing of victims. That's because victims of abuse have the deck stacked against them when it comes to reporting or disclosing the abuse to anyone. After all, the huge power imbalances and high levels of influence of the victimizers made them seem untouchable, since they belong to the group of people who were in charge of exercising this fellowshipping, meaning that disclosing what took place might mean the victim gets disfellowshipped and shunned by members of the religion, including friends and family. What's more, since there are no women elders or ministerial servants in the Jehovah's Witnesses who are led by a patriarchal leadership structure, it makes it less likely for women to feel comfortable disclosing abuse. Women are not only banned from any sort of control or authority in the religion, creating a culture where women are made to feel inferior to men, affecting their self-worth and even their ability to refuse sex. Since this group is led by males, they often lack the skills to detect or discourage abuse, and female survivors often felt too uncomfortable to disclose their abuse to men. And when victims reached out, they report being often blamed for the abuse, with some being told that they wore seductive clothing or looked and acted older than their age. Again, the report goes in depth on the testimonies of members of this religion, who they were and how exactly they were blamed as victims, often telling them as young girls that they were developing infatuations with abusers and minimizing the abuser's responsibility. Plus, no woman is involved in the decision making, so women are often placed in a position where the people in power are the friends of their abuser. The investigation also quotes the Australian Royal Commission's investigation into the Jehovah's Witnesses to confirm how this isn't just happening in New Zealand. This is how the group operates overseas too. The investigation also dedicates a whole subsection to the fear of shunning experimented by everyone, even victims, since it made breaking away from this religion particularly difficult when it also meant being shunned by their whole social circle. It highlights how this is especially threatening when it comes to Maori and other minorities with strong family and community ties. The report also includes the testimony of current active members in the religion who are CSA victims and who, even after disclosing their stories to the report, ask to remain anonymous because they know that they will lose everything if the group knew they had spoken out against it. It again quotes the ARC to confirm the findings, and the fear of shunning is actively preventing victims from speaking out about what they've experienced inside this group. The report then delves into the isolationist nature of Jehovah's Witnesses, with their insularity and distrust of government agencies led to internal handling of issues, often discouraging members from reporting matters to the police. Issues like CSA were treated as sins rather than crimes and were dealt with by church elders using a two-witness rule to establish guilt. Members are forbidden from conducting online research or accessing information not published on the Jehovah's Witnesses website, labeling external information as lies and apostates those who sought it. Former members described a childhood of social isolation and religious fear, with teachings to distrust government agencies and view those outside the faith as part of Satan's world. That shows how members are, therefore, discouraged from forming relationships or bonds with non-faith individuals, and are often restricted from associating with worldly people, even if they are wider family members. There were many personal testimonies describing the lasting impact of isolation in this report, feeling like outcasts even after leaving their religion. They recall being prohibited from normal social activities with school friends and other children outside the faith. This fear of outsiders is also mixed with their superiority complex by believing they are the one part of the world that isn't controlled by Satan, which also makes it difficult to engage with the outside world in a relaxed and trusting manner, and just perpetuates a state of constant violence against perceived threats to their faith. The report points out how the insularity of the faith also limits the range of people to whom abuse can be reported, making it challenging to disclose it inside the religion and unthinkable to discuss it outside the faith's internal process. And the elders, the few people to whom these things can be reported, are completely inept when it comes to dealing with these allegations and crimes. Elders have no secular vetting and are instead appointed based solely on scriptural qualifications and believed to be inspired by the Holy Spirit. This group does not give them any kind of secular training on child safety, safeguarding, or abuse prevention. Elders received a one-day course known as the Kingdom Ministry School for Elders, which often focuses on current policies inside the religion. The course has added a section on CSA since 1997, but the report found that the training given was insufficient to equip elders for dealing with such complex issues. Former elders testified to this, acknowledging they get no training on how to deal with CSA or even how to keep children safe. This inevitably leads us to the obvious but still dreaded consequence of it all: the CSA happening inside the religion. The inquiry received at least one CSA allegation inside this religion within the inquiry period, but it mostly focuses on the testimony of survivors of this group. The first testimony talks about how the survivor's family thought that she, at 15 years old, was not behaving well after her brother and his friends forced themselves on her. So their solution was to have regular Bible studies in an elder's home conducted by his wife. Soon, she was joining the family for other religious activities like family worship and witnessing. However, after her Bible studies with the elder's wife, the elder would drive her home, and that's how he started forcing himself on her, taking her to an isolated place to do it, with his assault gradually escalating during the course of about 5 months. The report also includes how the Jehovah's Witnesses leadership responded to this case, saying that since they've never told elders to drive teenagers home unsupervised, they could not be liable for what the elder did. This is infuriating because very obviously the teenager was there because the cult taught her that she needed to obey elders and get indoctrination sessions, and made the whole structure that gave this elder power in the first place, which is what this report concludes. Not only that, but the report talks about how Jehovah's Witnesses view what they talk about as fatherless children, children who lack a parental authority either in general or in the faith, and correctly pointed out how this cult definitely gave the elder the power and authority he needed to do this. The report also talks about other examples of the horrors in this religion, often with victims having family members force themselves on them and using their status in the religion to protect themselves. To my surprise, the religion supplied information admitting to CSA happening inside the religion, but it was only related to 4 elders. One who had committed CSA with a girl between the ages of 8 and 12 years old, one elder developing an inappropriate relationship with a 15-year-old, an elder committing CSA with another 15-year-old, and an elder removed from his position for what the cult called inappropriate behavior involving a minor. The report points out how the records were extremely limited to the point where it cannot even be determined whether the children were in danger in the care of the faith or not, even if that's what the cult says happened. And the suffering inside this religion isn't just caused by CSA. The report dedicates a whole section on allegations of psychological and emotional abuse. It described the testimony of a woman who was interrogated as a 12-year-old girl alone by 3 male elders with no support, recounting the whole process as abusive as her CSA experience. Other witnesses also testified to being interrogated while isolating as teenagers, with the experience being described as terrifying and traumatizing. That's because the Jehovah's Witnesses take on the responsibility of caring for children and young people during judicial investigations, often without their parents present. And this practice of questioning CSA survivors during this investigation was found by the New Zealand report to also be inappropriate and emotionally or psychologically abusive, often causing lasting emotional and psychological trauma. Now, this is the worst chapter, but I think the next and practically last chapter, because the other one is just there for the conclusions, is the light after the dark, even if it takes us a while to get there, because the report could have ended right here. Many reports and investigations of this kind have. This, horrifying as it is everything you need to certify how children are extremely vulnerable to CSA in this religion directly because of this religion's practices. Most investigations and even documentaries I've seen on the topic, and I've seen pretty much all of them, end here. However, the New Zealand report goes one step further in chapter 5. You see, when this happens, the religion's response, if it exists at all, limits to, oh, well, we're going to do some changes so this doesn't happen again, thank you. And despite how damaging they are, it's this continuous pushing the issue to the side with cosmetic fixes that maintains this problem's existence. That's why I was very happy and felt almost vindicated when I read Chapter 5, Steps by the Jehovah's Witnesses to Prevent and Respond to the Risk of Abuse in Care. This chapter basically acknowledges that this isn't the first time this cult has faced criticism because of their practices, and describes the insufficient responses this cult has had towards them. The report found that in the 80s, when this religion was under the same criticism, the religion simply made magazines and books mentioning how parents can protect children from CSA, a practice that continues to this day, and how, since the 90s, the religion provides instructions to elders on how to respond to CSA allegations. It even quotes a 1993 issue of Awake on a section called Protect Your Children, which says, "Your child is in danger. The molestation of children is an ugly reality. It affects more of us than cancer." To me, that quote was chilling because is this religion admitting that CSA is a far more prevalent issue in this religion than cancer? The report also lists the policies included in the Elder's Manual, which merely limits to describe what CSA is. It then goes on to reiterate all the barriers a victim has to face as going forward, like a fearful environment, the control, fear of shunning, and disconnection from secular authorities, and how that has led to historical failures on the part of this religion to solve the problem. That's because in this religion, even if a victim speaks out, they will only speak out to elders. And the elders will lead a spiritual investigation to treat this crime as a sin with a judicial process that's traumatizing to children. What's more, the report talks about the two-witness rule, which requires 2 witnesses to establish wrongdoing before forming a judicial committee. That means that an abuser would face no consequences unless the abuse was witnessed by another person or another witness reports similar conduct. This causes complaints of CSA to be taken less seriously, since CSA typically occurs without witnesses. It even quotes the Elder's Handbook and how it indicates a hesitation to accept testimonies of children and young people, further diminishing their weight. And then, the investigation does what I've been hoping investigations on the Jehovah's Witnesses do, and what I've predicted investigations were inevitably going to start doing. It goes into the international context. Whereas before, they had simply mentioned the IRC in passing, Now, the investigation delves deep into other investigations before it, concretely the inquiries in Australia and in England and Wales. It starts by recapping the Australian Royal Commission, which investigated 2 survivors' experiences of CSA within the Jehovah's Witnesses and the organization's response. It also examined broader systems, policies, and procedures for handling and preventing abuse, mentioning multiple similarities with the New Zealand inquiry, including shared legislation for child protections, their centralized structure, and common policies within the Jehovah's Witnesses. And it obviously went through the horrifying statistics that the ARC found, mentioning how, since 1950, the Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia received reports of abuse involving at least 1,800 alleged victims. 11% of alleged perpetrators were elders or ministerial servants, and 3% were appointed to these positions after the allegations. 40% of perpetrators were disfellowshipped, but 57% of these 40 were reinstated, with 19% disfellowshipped more than once. The Jehovah's Witnesses disputed claims that it did not report abuse to the police, arguing that multiple factors, like legal and moral considerations, influence whether or not the witness reported, even though none of the known cases of CSA in Australia were reported to the police. They maintained that male elders determining guilt was no different from male judges in secular courts, and expressed concern that findings might discourage disclosure to religious authorities. And it obviously quotes the conclusion of the Australian investigation. The Jehovah's Witnesses' responses were inadequate and that children were not adequately protected due to outdated and inappropriate policies, including the 2-witness rule. Also, the internal disciplinary system was criticized for not being child or survival focused and for weak sanctions that allowed abusers to remain in the community. Finally, the lack of mandatory reporting to authorities was highlighted as a significant failure in protecting children. And the investigation even included how negatively the Jehovah's Witness religion reacted to this investigation of Australia. In 2018, the organization criticized the Commission's focus on their beliefs and practices, arguing it should have targeted the lack of uniform mandatory reporting laws. They claimed the investigation unfairly conflated familial and institutional abuse and didn't focus enough on their education efforts. This religion reportedly viewed the investigation as inherently unfair and expressed concern about the reliance on private session findings, trying to cast doubt on the evidence provided. And finally, this report went into the ICSA inquiry in England and Wales that examined child protection in the Jehovah's Witnesses. This investigation was quite flawed, and I have a lot of criticism for it, but it still determined that Jehovah's Witnesses have the 3rd highest number of CSA victims, 15 or 11%, after the Catholic and Anglican churches, indicating the 2-witness rule and the lack of vetting in the religion as contributing factors to it, which gets complicated when the religion tries to rely on religious texts instead of what's best for children. I'm betting they would have also included Norway's removal of religious status to the Jehovah's Witnesses if the whole thing hadn't just concluded a few months ago. But this is what I said when I made a video about the Norway thing, that these investigations establish a precedent. Now, any Western countries has examples of other Western countries with full freedom of religion looking at this cult and determining independently that this is a dangerous place for children, and for the exact same reasons. Spain also determined that it was lawful and correct to label this religion as a harmful cult, with efforts to use that court decision to force the government to take actions against the policies that put children in danger in this cult. It's no longer just isolated investigations in 1 or 2 countries. Now, the investigations into the dangers of this religion are starting to quote past investigations from other countries to prove how this is a systematic problem across the religion. How this isn't the first time that they're made aware of this by a government. And how, if the government doesn't take action, this will keep happening just as it keeps happening everywhere else where they've investigated the cult. This investigation closes with the summary of its finding, which basically reduced to this. Elders have positions of power given to them by the religion. The religion assumed responsibility for the care of children in witnesses' activities, pastoral support, volunteer work, and other activities, along with investigation and judicial committees, where children were under the care of the religion through the elders and not under the direct care of their parents. It remarks how there's credible evidence of CSA inside the religion and of emotional and psychological abuse by the elders when children came out with the truth and were questioned. It determined 3 factors that increase the risk of CSA in this religion: the power imbalance in this religion, the barriers to disclosing what happened due to multiple reasons, including the lack of women in places of authority, the fear of exclusion, and the isolationist nature of the religion, and the lack of vetting and training of elders in child protection and CSA prevention. The investigation then goes on to say that it's impossible to quantify the full extent of this abuse inside this religion due to those reasons and due to inadequate record keeping. And finally, it finds that the steps taken by this religion to prevent and to respond to CSA were inadequate because elders are still not veteran trained, because the rules and policies on CSA come from multiple separate sources inside the religion, and because the whole process of raising, handling, and responding to concerns or complaints of CSA in this religion were inadequate. Basically, the New Zealand government found that the Jehovah's Witnesses have a structure that makes CSA possible, but makes it so reporting and defending victims is almost impossible. And honestly, after covering this stuff for almost 3 years now, I am very happy with the results of this investigation. Let's recap. We have Norway, Spain, Australia, England, and now New Zealand looking into this cult and determining that for one reason or another, this is a damaging cult, especially when it comes to children. It has happened so frequently lately that now investigations are having deja vu moments, looking into past investigations and seeing that this religion keeps having the same problems for the same reasons and refuses to change or to fix anything so this doesn't happen again. With so many investigations around the world by first world countries in Western places with strong freedom of religion looking into this cult and determining that it is a dangerous place for children, it becomes more and more likely that we'll see the United States finally take a look at the Jehovah's Witnesses. I believe that this is what the religion is trying to prevent, and they have been failing over and over and over again. Because when the United States government looks into the Jehovah's Witnesses, the governing body will have to face a decision. They'll either stay and testify in court in front of the whole country and the world, or they move their headquarters to a different country, hoping to at least delay the inevitable. And I, for one, cannot wait to see what happens then. Thank you so much to my supporters, especially these guys right here. This took forever. I had to read a lot and understand a lot and ask a lot of questions to a lot of people so I was able to just summarize all of this for you. And it would not be possible without my patrons over here. Thank you so much. Please consider supporting me with any donation. If you have money. If you don't have money, then no.